Every autumn, my college friends and I reunite for a camping trip to relive old memories and escape the pressures of our jobs. This year, we decided to venture into a remote forest known for its untouched beauty and lack of cell phone reception, a perfect place to disconnect. Our group consisted of me, Alex, his girlfriend Mia, and our longtime friend Jordan. We arrived at the edge of the forest in the late afternoon, parking our car near an old, weathered sign that warned hikers to stay on marked. We shrugged it off, eager to blaze our own path and find a secluded spot far from any other campers. As we trekked deeper into the woods, the canopy thickened and the sunlight began to wane. After a couple of hours, we stumbled upon a clearing beside a tranquil stream. It seemed like the ideal campsite, so we set up our tents and gathered wood for a fire. Night fell quickly, bringing with it a chill that made the warmth of the fire all the more comforting. We sat in a circle, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. Jordan, ever the storyteller, began recounting local legends he had read about. He mentioned tales of people entering these woods and never returning, spirits that lured hikers off the path, and a mysterious cabin that appeared only at night. We laughed it off, attributing his stories to overactive imagination. As the fire died down, we decided to turn in. The silence of the forest was profound, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. Sometime after midnight, I awoke to a faint sound, distant singing that floated on the wind. It was hauntingly beautiful, a melody that was both alluring and unsettling. I sat up, listening intently. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the forest. Curiosity got the better of me. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the crisp night air. The moon cast an ethereal glow, illuminating the trees in a silvery light. I noticed that Alex and Mia's tent was unzipped and empty. Thinking they might have gone to explore, I walked over to Jordan's tent to check if he was awake. Before I could call out, I saw him emerge from his tent with a puzzled expression. He had heard the singing too. We exchanged uneasy glances and decided to look for Alex and Mia. As we moved away from the campsite, the singing grew louder but remained elusive, seeming to echo from all directions. We called out their names, but only our voices answered back. The forest seemed different, trees twisted in unnatural shapes, and a thick mist began to weave between them. After walking for what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a small wooden cabin that looked ancient and worn. A shiver ran down my spine as Jordan's story about the mysterious cabin rushed back to me. A dim light flickered in the window. Against our better judgment, we approached the cabin. The door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, we stepped inside to find a single room illuminated by candles. Symbols were etched into the walls and floor, and in the center stood Alex and Mia, motionless with their backs to us. Relief washed over me. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. As we moved closer, they turned slowly to face us. Their eyes were vacant, and their expressions blank. Mia raised her arm and pointed behind us. We turned to see a shadowy figure emerging from the darkness, a woman with long, flowing hair and eyes that seemed to pierce through us. She began to sing the same haunting melody we had heard earlier. I felt a sudden heaviness, my limbs sluggish as if wading through water. Jordan grabbed my arm, snapping me out of the trance. He whispered urgently that we needed to leave immediately. We tried to pull Alex and Mia with us, but they wouldn't move, their feet seemingly rooted to the spot. The woman extended her hand toward us, and the cabin wall started closing in. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly. Panic surged through me. Realizing we couldn't help them, Jordan and I bolted out of the cabin and sprinted into the woods. The forest was now a maze of shadows and mist. The trees seemed to shift and move, blocking our path. The singing followed us, growing louder and more dissonant. My heart pounded in my chest as we dodged low branches and leaped over fallen logs. After what felt like an eternity, we burst through a thicket and found ourselves back at our campsite. The fire was burning brightly, which was strange since we had let it die out hours ago. Exhausted and terrified, we collapsed next to it. As dawn broke, the forest returned to its normal state. There was no sign of Alex and Mia. We waited for hours, hoping they would return, but they never did. With heavy hearts, we made our way back to civilization and contacted the authorities. Search parties were dispatched, scouring the forest for days. No traces of them were found. The cabin we described didn't exist according to the maps, and no one else had ever reported seeing it. Haunted by guilt and unanswered questions, Jordan and I have tried to move on with our lives, but sometimes, in the quiet moments between wakefulness and sleep, I hear that haunting melody. I wonder if it's a call or a warning. I no longer seek adventure in the wilderness. The allure of the unknown has been overshadowed by the memory of that night. If you ever find yourself tempted to stray off the marked trails, remember our story. Some paths lead to places from which you might never return. A group of us decided to go on a weekend camping trip to a lake nestled deep within a national forest. There were 6 of us old college friends looking to reconnect. The lake was said to be pristine, untouched by the usual influx of tourists due to its hidden location. We arrived early Saturday morning, the sun shining brightly as we hiked the few miles from where we parked our cars. The trail was overgrown, indicating how seldom people ventured this way. When we reached the lake, we were not disappointed. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the surrounding trees like a perfect mirror. We set up our tents along the shoreline and spent the day fishing, swimming, and reminiscing about old times. As evening approached, we built a large campfire and cooked the fish we'd caught. The conversation flowed easily, laughter echoing across the water. As darkness fell, the lake's surface became perfectly still, reflecting the starry sky above. It was a breathtaking sight. Sarah, one of our friends, suggested we take a moment to appreciate the beauty and silence. We all agreed, settling into a comfortable hush. After a few minutes, I noticed something odd in the lake's reflection. The stars seemed to be shifting, forming patterns that didn't match the sky above. I nudged my friend Mike and pointed it out. He frowned, also noticing the discrepancy. Then the reflected stars began to form shapes, vague outlines of faces that became increasingly clear. They were not any of us, but unfamiliar, solemn faces that seemed to be looking up from beneath the water. A sense of unease settled over the group as more of us noticed the phenomenon. Sarah stood up, suggesting we move away from the shoreline. As we backed up, the reflections changed again. This time we saw the silhouettes of people standing behind us, but when we turned around, there was no one there. Panic started to set in. Kyle, the most skeptical among us, insisted it was a trick of light or our imaginations fueled by fatigue. He walked back to the water's edge to prove his point. As he stood there, his reflection didn't match his movements. When he waved his hand, the reflection remained still, staring back at him with a sinister grin. He stumbled backward, finally shaken. We decided it was best to extinguish the fire and retreat to our tents. Inside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence outside was oppressive, devoid of the usual sounds of nature. Around midnight, we heard a soft splashing sound. Peering out of the tent, I saw figures emerging from the lake, translucent forms that glided across the surface toward the shore. They moved without sound, leaving no ripples behind. I whispered to the others, and we gathered together, huddling in fear. The figures reached the shore and began to spread out, their movements slow and deliberate. One by one, they approached our tents. I could see their features more clearly, now pale faces with empty eyes. One of them stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, afraid that any movement would give away my presence. The figure leaned forward, and I heard a whisper inside my mind, a chilling voice saying we had trespassed where we didn't belong. I mustered the courage to speak, apologizing softly and promising we would leave at first light. The whispering ceased, and the figures began to retreat back toward the lake, disappearing beneath the surface without a trace. At dawn, we packed up in silence. The lake looked normal again, the reflections matching the sky above. As we hiked back to our cars, no one spoke about what we had witnessed. It felt like a shared nightmare we all wanted to forget. Weeks later, I did some research and discovered that the lake was considered sacred land by the indigenous people who once inhabited the area. It was said to be a gateway between worlds, a place where the spirits of the departed could cross over. I haven't returned to that lake, and I doubt any of my friends have either. The memory of those faces in the water serves as a haunting reminder that some places are meant to be left undisturbed. Every summer, I embark on a solo camping trip to disconnect from the digital world and find some peace in nature. This year, I decided to explore a remote canyon known for its stunning rock formations and isolation. It was miles away from any town, the perfect place to find solitude. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. I parked my truck at the trailhead and hiked several miles into the canyon, the walls towering above me like ancient sentinels. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my boots and the occasional call of a distant bird. I found a flat area near a shallow stream and set up my tent. As dusk settled in, I built a small fire and prepared a simple meal. The sky turned a deep indigo, stars beginning to pierce the veil of night. I felt a profound sense of calm, the kind that only comes when you're far from the chaos of civilization. After dinner, I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling of the wood and the gentle flow of the stream. Then, faintly at first, I heard something else, a distant echo that seemed to bounce off the canyon walls. It sounded like a voice, but I couldn't make out any words. I assumed it was just the wind swirling through the rocks, creating auditory illusions. As the night deepened, the echoing grew more distinct. It wasn't just random noise, it had a rhythm, a pattern. It sounded like someone was singing a haunting melody that reverberated through the canyon. I felt a chill run down my spine. I was supposed to be alone out here. I stood up and scanned the darkness, my campfire casting flickering shadows. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but only my voice echoed back. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, perhaps the result of fatigue after a long day. I decided to turn in for the night, hoping that sleep would ease my nerves. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tightly. Lying there, I listened intently, but all I could hear was the soft murmur of the stream. My eyelids grew heavy, and I began to drift off. A sudden piercing scream jolted me awake. It echoed violently off the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell where it originated. My heart pounded as I scrambled out of my sleeping bag. The scream subsided into a low wail, then transformed back into that eerie singing. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dim glow. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the landscape but saw nothing unusual. The singing continued, more insistent now, like a siren's call. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I walked toward the sound, each step filled with hesitation. The terrain became more rugged, and the canyon walls seemed to close in. The melody grew louder but remained elusive, always seeming just out of reach. I reached a narrow passage between two towering rocks. As I stepped through, the singing stopped. I found myself in a small clearing illuminated by the moonlight. In the center stood a stone altar covered in ancient carvings. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, shadows began to move along the canyon walls, converging toward the altar. They had human-like forms but lacked any distinguishing features. They circled the altar, their movements synchronized with an unheard rhythm. I stood there, frozen, as one of the shadows turned toward me. Though it had no eyes, I felt it staring directly into my soul. A whisper filled the air, not from around me but inside my head, telling me to leave and never return. I didn't need any more encouragement. I turned and ran back the way I came, stumbling over rocks and scraping my hands as I fell more than once. The singing resumed, louder and more chaotic, filling the air with a cacophony of voices. I reached my campsite, hastily packed what I could, and abandoned the rest. I made my way back to the trailhead under the cover of darkness, the haunting melody following me until I reached my truck. I drove through the night without stopping, the images of those shadowy figures etched into my mind. I haven't gone camping since that night. The solitude I once craved now reminds me of the echoing canyon and the voices that dwell there. Last autumn, I joined a group of outdoor enthusiasts for a weekend camping trip in the mountains. Most of us were strangers connected through an online forum dedicated to hiking and wilderness adventures. We met at the trailhead, exchanged introductions, and set off into the forest. The first day was invigorating. The leaves had turned shades of red and gold, and the air was crisp. We hiked several miles before setting up camp near a serene lake. As night fell, we gathered around a roaring campfire, sharing stories and enjoying the camaraderie. One of the group members, an older man named Henry, suggested we tell scary stories. We all agreed, eager to add some thrill to the night. People took turns, each tale more chilling than the last. When it was Henry's turn, he leaned forward, his face lit eerily by the flames. He spoke of a legend local to these mountains, a tale of shadow creatures that mimicked the appearance of humans. According to the story, they lured unsuspecting campers away from their groups, leading them deeper into the woods, never to be seen again. We laughed nervously, brushing it off as just another ghost story. Later, as the fire died down, we retreated to our tents. I was sharing a tent with a guy named Alex, whom I'd gotten along with during the day. We chatted for a bit before sleep claimed us. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. Thinking someone was heading to the makeshift restroom area, I tried to go back to sleep. Then I heard a voice whisper my name. It was faint, but unmistakable. I sat up listening intently. The voice called out again, a little louder. It sounded like Alex, but that didn't make sense because he was right next to me, fast asleep. I shook his shoulder to wake him, but he mumbled something incoherent and turned over. Curious and a bit unnerved, I decided to step outside to check. The camp was quiet, the embers of the fire casting a dim glow. I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees that looked like Henry. He motioned for me to come over. I walked toward him, whispering his name, but he turned and started moving into the forest. I hesitated, recalling the story he had told. I called out softly, asking if everything was all right. He didn't respond and continued deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed. The darkness enveloped us, and I struggled to keep up. Suddenly he stopped and turned to face me. His features were obscured, but something about his posture seemed off. I asked if he needed help, but he remained silent. Then, in a voice that sounded distorted, he whispered my name again. A chill ran through me, and I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't Henry. I backed away slowly, trying not to provoke whatever stood before me. The figure began to advance, its movements jerky and unnatural. Panic surged, and I turned and ran back toward the campsite. Branches whipped against my face, and the forest seemed darker than before. I could hear footsteps behind me, closing in quickly. The whispers grew louder, echoing all around me. I burst into the clearing and tripped over a log, falling hard onto the ground. The camp was just ahead, and I could see the tents silhouetted against the night sky. I scrambled to my feet and rushed to Alex's tent, diving inside and zipping it up behind me. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might wake him. Breathing heavily, I listened for any signs of pursuit. Outside, everything was silent. No footsteps, no whispers. I peeked out of the tent but saw nothing unusual. Exhausted and terrified, I stayed awake until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. When morning came, I found Henry sitting by the fire, sipping coffee. He greeted me warmly, showing no signs of having been out in the woods. I pulled him aside and asked if he had been out during the night. He looked puzzled and shook his head, saying he had slept it through the night. I recounted what had happened, and a concerned look crossed his face. He gathered the group and suggested we cut the trip short. Everyone seemed disappointed but agreed when he insisted it was for the best. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest, which had seemed so inviting the day before, now felt oppressive. On the hike back, I stayed close to the group, constantly glancing over my shoulder. When we reached the trailhead, we said our goodbyes. Henry pulled me aside one last time and handed me a small carved wooden charm. He said it was a protective token and advised me to keep it close. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I haven't been camping since. The charm stays with me, a reminder of the shadows that lurk just beyond the safety of the campfire. Every year, my friends and I plan a camping trip to disconnect from our busy lives. This time we chose a remote spot deep within the national forest, a place untouched by the usual crowd of weekend campers. We wanted solitude, and we found it. We arrived late in the afternoon, setting up our tents near a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. As night fell, we built a campfire and settled in for the evening, sharing stories and laughter under the starlit sky. Around midnight, the fire began to dwindle, and the conversation grew quieter. That's when I first noticed it, a faint whisper carried by the wind. I thought I was imagining things, but then I saw my friend Lisa tilt her head, as if listening intently. She asked if we heard something, and we all paused, straining to catch any sound. The whispering grew slightly louder, but we couldn't make out any words. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the woods, a soft murmur that ebbed and flowed. Mark, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off as the wind passing through the trees. We agreed it was probably nothing and decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, the whispers still lingering in my mind. Sleep came fitfully, with strange dreams that slipped away as soon as I tried to grasp them. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a chill creeping through my sleeping bag. The whispering had returned, more pronounced now. It felt closer, almost right outside my tent. I sat up, my heart pounding. I could see shadows moving against the tent walls, but the fire had died down, and there shouldn't have been any light to cast them. The whispers swirled around me, overlapping voices that seemed to be speaking in an unknown language. Gathering my courage, I unzipped the tent and peered outside. The forest was cloaked in darkness, but the shadows continued to flicker at the edge of my vision. I looked over to my friends' tents and saw that they were all closed, no signs of movement. Suddenly, a figure darted between the trees, a pale silhouette that vanished as quickly as it appeared. I stumbled out of the tent, trying to follow it, but the darkness was too thick. The whispers grew louder, circling me, making it impossible to pinpoint their source. I called out to my friends, but my voice sounded small and muffled. No one stirred. It was as if I was the only one awake in a world that had fallen silent, except for those relentless whispers. Panic set in, and I rushed back to my tent, zipping it up and curling into a ball, hoping the thin fabric would offer some protection. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When morning light filtered through the tent, I felt a wave of relief. Stepping outside, I found my friends gathered around the fire pit, looking uneasy. Lisa asked if anyone else had experienced strange dreams or heard unusual sounds. We all exchanged glances, realizing that each of us had been awakened by the whispering. Mark admitted he had seen shadows moving in the woods but thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. We decided it was probably just our minds reacting to the unfamiliar environment. Determined not to let it ruin our trip, We spent the day hiking and exploring the area. The beauty of the forest in daylight helped ease our nerves. By evening, we felt more at ease and decided to stay another night. As darkness fell, we rebuilt the campfire and tried to keep the mood light. However, an unspoken tension lingered among us. The whispers returned sooner this time, just as the last light of day faded. They were clearer now, almost forming words that we still couldn't understand. A sense of dread settled over us. We agreed to stick together, gathering our sleeping bags around the fire for the rest of the night. The whispers surrounded us, and the shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to watch with unseen eyes. None of us slept much that night. When dawn finally broke, we packed up hastily, eager to leave the whispering woods behind. As we loaded the car, I took one last look at the forest. For a moment I thought I saw figures standing among the trees, watching us with blank faces. We never spoke of the whispers again, but sometimes, late at night, I hear that faint murmur in the wind, reminding me of the voices that lurk just beyond the edge of the light.